We're rolling. Okay. So I'm Joe Rodriguez, and I'm here with Jack Deren, and we are here today to talk about your life in racing, and your long career.
As
Um,
stories begin, once upon a time, huh?
well, this is a very impromptu type of interview where we're going to take several little detours off the questions and things like that, and talk about whatever you want. We'll start with. So where were you born and raised?
Where was I born and raised? Was Hazleton, Pennsylvania, and grew up in Hazleton. That year was 1934 when that happened.
A couple of years ago.
A couple of years ago, yes. And then when World War II came along, my parents moved down to Philadelphia because that's where all the jobs were needed. And we lived in Philadelphia for a while, and that's where I went through grammar school and high school. And later we moved up to Norristown after I graduated from Spring Garden Institute, where I did a full 2-year scholarship for machine design. So that's the basis of my uh, formal education in machinery. The rest was all seat of the pants stuff.
Now you were into design. You entered a contest. From what remember you had a contest. Remember the contest that you had entered?
Oh, during that time period in high school, the Fisher Body Craftsman's Guild. Fisher Body does the designing for GM, and they run a contest every year. They'll send you a nice brochure and a nice drawing, a basic drawing showing wheelbase and curb angles and windshield angles, and it's up to you to design and build a model to those specs. And living in Philadelphia, we're in an apartment. My workbench was usually slid under my bed every day, and at night I'd bring it out and lay it on the bed. And on that, I built, thanks to my parents being able to tolerate the wood chips. But I built a model for the Fisher Body Craftsman's Guild, and I got a second state award out of it.
Wow.
They said it was very practical, but in their minds, they're looking for spaceship designs and all.
Wow. Well, tell me a little about tell me a little bit about your mom and your dad. As you know.
My dad was a mechanic, pure and simple. Um, he worked for Matchewella's Dairy in Hazleton, and in his spare time, uh, again, this is the late 30s, he built from Mechanics Illustrated map or an article in Mechanics. He built a biplane. Did all the wood things, had the wings. I remember seeing the wings. I remember seeing the body, the fuselage hanging in the garage. And he says, I got that far, but he couldn't afford motors and instruments or whatever. He claims he did have a motorcycle motor attached to it to turn the prop. He said it did roll on the ground by itself, but never got enough speed to even think of getting airborne. And that's when his desire to continue for funding, he just stopped. So it laid there for quite a while, and my grandmother, I remember burning it away to make room in the garden for planting veggies.
Well, I mean, your dad, he was a really creative guy, mechanically too. He had made a few things. One that sticks out in my head was the the press for the watches. You remember?
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Well, he's a tinkerer, and he had a lathe, a little Craftsman lathe, and a drill press. And when he got home from work, he'd have supper, and he was always down the cellar of the house making something. And you are referring to a little brass affair set up like a press, and had a Teflon block on it or nylon block on it, all machined out,
Mm-hmm.
because he would use the machine shops at work. He worked at Leeds and Northrop, and they actually had a club where the workers could join and come in and use after work for 3 hours. For 3 hours, they could use the facility, drilling, machining, and all that.
Mm-hmm.
But they had a cute little thing. And I'm, what's that for? He says, well, when you have to put a new battery in your wristwatch, you pop it up and put the battery, and that presses it down so you don't break the crystal. He'd go through all that trouble
Wow.
for trivia.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I have a whole collection of the things he's made.
Yep.
A winch for picking up a Corvette motor, or back then a Jaguar motor.
Mm-hmm. Now you still have his drill press, the Atlas drill press.
I still have the drill press. I still have the lathe.
Yeah. Now he did a really cool modification on that Atlas drill press, making it variable speed, correct?
Well, if anyone knows about today's cars or motorcycles or go-karts, the variable speed of two pulleys that'll expand and contract. Motor's driving one and the load is driving the other. And according to your RPMs, it'll change ratio.
Mm-hmm.
So he made that up over the top of the drill press,
Right.
so that he could go real fast for a small drill or slow it down for a slow drill.
Yep, that's pretty slick.
And it worked just fine.
So, I guess moving a little bit further forward, well, you were also into aircraft, pretty. You were an enthusiast of aircraft when you were a kid too.
I'm an enthusiast, but I never picked up on the pursuit of it, going off to the airports and things. I know one guy that all his life, every moment he had, he would go up to the Hodensail airport, try to get some time, fly this, fly that. He's now flying the biggest airplanes you want up there commercially, So that was his life. I never had a goal in aircraft. I liked four wheels on the ground.
And that's what brings us to.
And I never really
racing.
got involved with two wheels. That you're doing a two-wheeler car.
Yes.
Motorcycles, to me, have the technology and the engineering, but I like four wheels.
Got to have four wheels on the ground. Well, that brings us to racing. So, tell us how you got into racing and how you came to get into that end of it.
Well, going to high school in the 50s, graduated in 52, and in that time period, our group in Norristown and in Philadelphia, it was all roundy round or drag racing, dirt tracks or drag racing. And I was going to work one day at the Burroughs Research Center in Paoli, and this little car went by, and I said, "What the hell was that?" A TR3 Triumph.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's not exciting today, but to then it was. So I had to follow him, find out where it was, and look at it. And that's the sports car bug that bit me.
Mm-hmm.
And I continued down those lines. A mix of the two came when a friend of ours, and we had a hot rod group, a big garage. Guy offered a garage, and there were about 30 of us that worked in it at night. And I heard about this wrecked Jaguar, XK140. And I was in the process of building a 5-window 32 Ford hot rod.
Now, this is your first car you're talking about.
Oh, my first car was a 1936 Ford 3-window coupe.
Tell me a little bit about that car.
It was a daily driver to Spring Garden Institute, from in Philadelphia down to school. Blah, blah, blah. I never really got involved in building anything on the car because I didn't have a place to work on it. The next car up was a 1940 Ford Opera Coupe. They called it an Opera Coupe because it had two little jump seats behind the normal seats.
The fat fendered Fords.
They would fold down and you had to
Yeah.
stare and look at each other. You couldn't see forward.
Right. Right. Yep.
But that one, I did a massaging on that. I chopped the top and
Hmm.
did a lot of interior work. And I did all of that because I didn't have a garage in Norristown, but I would drive back and forth to my homelands of Hazleton and Wilkes-Barre that I was growing up in. And I'd come up on weekends, and if I had welding and stuff to do, and go back down, go to work.
Hmm.
So that developed to be a nice little running road car.
Well, that brings us to the 32 and the car that you were telling us about, the Jaguar. You
The
know,
Jaguar,
tell us about that car.
while building that 32, I was going to put a Lincoln uh, cubes. I don't remember. I think they were 3.5 liter, the big Lincoln.
Hmm.
But I saw the Jaguar and I said, I'm going to put the Jaguar motor in it. So I built this 32 Ford up. Uh, I didn't chop the top, but I sectioned the body heavily that the fender lines, the rear fender lines, are almost the same height as the trunk lid. You don't have that big gap. And I used the Jaguar hood, the radiator, the engine, the transmission, the burl dashboard, and the leather seats, uh, and the back end converted all four wheels to do the wire wheels,
Hmm.
the
Yep.
bolt-on
Yep.
hubs like
Yep. Yep.
you did later.
Yes. Yes.
So there were times when I'd have that car out at somewhere and people would look around and walk and say, what model Jaguar is this? The engine was long enough, obviously, than a four-cylinder V8. I had to open up the cowl vent
Hmm.
to get at the back cylinders. And sitting in the car, I was looking out the rear quarter window, not the
Hmm.
side door window,
Right.
which left about 6 inches between the steering wheel
Hmm.
and the door jamb. So I had to make the steering wheel fold out like a Mercedes CSL.
This way.
Get
Right.
out of the way to get
Together.
out.
Now, your mom actually helped you with the interior of that car, right?
Well, we didn't have a garage, and in the driveway at Norristown, my mom and I built the interior
Hmm. Hmm.
in white and yellow tuft and roll. Why I picked white and yellow, nowadays the dirt would just jump up on me immediately.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a nice car. I put about 20,000 miles on it as a daily driver,
Wow.
back and forth to Paoli.
And it was reliable.
And if I had to build another rod, I think I would go that route.
Yeah.
But I think on the front of it, instead of the Jaguar grill, I'd have stretched that vertically and put a BMW grill of the double ovals
That would be
with
cool.
a BMW motor in it instead of Jaguar. But at 88 years old, that's a project I don't want to get into.
Well, that car was a little bit of a movie star, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Well, we were all at our late night gathering at a diner somewhere, and a guy walks in. Two fellas walked in. You guys own those cars out there? So, well, yeah. Do you want to be in a movie? Well, what are you talking about? He says, well, we're doing a movie down in Phoenixville, and we need a couple scenes with hot rods in them. If you want to do that, come on down about 10:30 at night to the Downingtown Diner. And we're doing a movie called The Blob with Steve McQueen. So if you ever get a chance to look at the original, a very, very short scene because my car was lower than everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
And all you saw was the top of a 32 Ford going by.
Right.
And then, of course, it took me a little while to get out of the car. And the movie required everybody to stop quick and grab a fire extinguisher and run out because the blob didn't like CO2.
Right.
It would get cold.
That's right. Yeah, it would stop. It was the only thing that stopped it. That's
Yeah.
right. Wow. So in the movie, what parts did we? So we saw the roof of the car.
All you could see was the roof. Recognizing, you'd have to know in advance, like I'm telling you now.
Right.
It'll be a very close scene when the police gathered all the people, the hot rod boys in town,
Hmm.
and told them what they had to do and drive up to the high school. And so it was a very brief scene, but it was there.
So after that period, so you started to get into racing, like, or did you try your hand at racing at all? Did you think about
Well,
driving
the
at all?
Triumph got me interested in that, and I looked around, and obviously there was the Eastern Pennsylvania Sports Car Club, and I got involved with that. And being willing to travel or whatever, the first race I went to was at Elkhart Lake, Wisconsin, with a little Lola. I'm trying to think, Phoenixville Iron or Steel, John Milos, I think his name was. So we went out there. That was my first attempt to see sports car road racing. And the mechanic he had stays home because he didn't like to travel. And they were going to disqualify his car at tech inspection because the brakes were locked up. And I asked, "Where's their toolbox?" And he brings me a little cigar box with the only tools are for changing the 4 spark plugs. And I said, "Well, let me look at it." And basically, it was that the brake pedal rod was too long, and it wasn't releasing the pressure. So I shortened that up, and that made me a hero for the whole weekend because he was going to go home.
Right.
So the word must have gotten around that, hey, if you like this guy that wants to do any traveling and likes to get more and more involved, there was a little garage down below Paoli from when I was at Burroughs called Updraft One Enterprises. And that was Leroy Gain.
Hmm.
And he was involved with a guy called Penske when Roger himself was racing. So I used to go down after work and give Leroy a hand.
What year was that about?
That would be 50, 55,
Okay.
56,
Okay.
in that mid 50s range. And that went on and on a little bit. Roger went through a birdcage Maserati, the Coopers, the Porsches, RS50s, and all that.
And this is when Roger drove the cars himself.
And yeah, that was when
Yeah.
he himself would drive.
Hmm.
And I got involved with helping build the original Xerox special at Mullen Ford Body Shop.
Hmm. Tell us a little bit about that car,
The Xerox,
but also the people that were involved in that you worked with
in the which,
on the Xerox car.
yeah, but
So, the fabricator that you worked with,
uh, Bob Webb,
Bob Webb.
he was an Indianapolis aluminum bodybuilder. And we were working in the back end of Mullen Ford's body shop. And I was a gopher. I would just do whatever Bob would want me to do. And the Webb would fly in, work a day or two, and build the bodywork up that I took a lot of nice photos on. But it was amazing to me seeing this flat sheet of aluminum get formed into a body. And Bob said, he says, now most people, when they're building an aluminum body, they use the sandbag routine and the rubber mallets and pound into it to shape out a form. He says, I go the other way of shrinkage. So I'll take a piece of aluminum.
Mm-hmm.
When he first showed up, all his toolbox was a little carpenter's bag, and in there were a couple slappers, wooden slappers, and hammers and leather hammers and all. So, but he'd take a piece of aluminum with a little kiddie's baseball bat and give it a smack to make that bend in the aluminum.
Wow.
And then they'd put it on a barrel head and tie it down like that with 2 clamps and tap, 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 tap to compress this aluminum to be flat.
Now, just as a little detour, tell us about his workbench.
The workbench that he's doing this on, when we first got involved, he said, Jack, I need a piece of 1/2 inch steel, about 3 feet square. And then he said, "Get me an empty 55-gallon drum." And they took that aluminum or that steel and just welded it to the top of the drum,
Filled the barrel with water.
the barrel, and filled it with water.
Mm-hmm.
So now that's the most sturdy, cheapest workbench you could ever have. And he rounded off one radius this way,
Mm-hmm.
another radius that way,
Mm-hmm.
and on that with a hammer, planishing hammer, he built the Xerox Special.
Wow.
And he did it in a month.
Wow. Wow.
And Roger had called up Les Reichter, I think the name was, at Riverside, and told him what he was going to do, because the body was going over a Formula One Cooper chassis
Wow.
that I forget who crashed it at Watkins Glen Formula One, and Roger bought it.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the chassis that it'll be going on. And sports car racers are supposed to be a 2-passenger car and all
Mm-hmm.
that now.
Yeah.
But prior to then, Roger did call, got permission. You build it, bring it on out. So Roger built it, brought it out, and blew the doors off everyone. Did have doors.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's when they outlawed the center seater sports cars. The following year, it had to have 2 passengers, and they widened the body for 2 seats. If you were Toulouse-Lautrec, because your feet had to be all the way up,
right.
sit in this little, but it was a passenger seat.
Yep. Yeah.
And again, they said it's legal.
Yep. Yep.
He had a lot of foresight in racing.
As a little side note with Bob Webb, he was the guy that told you, there were a lot of roundy, fenders, especially on the Xerox car. And he made the one fender, and he's like, the trick is to make them both in the same.
Well, yeah, you get nowadays you buy what do they call those things?
English wheel or
the wheel.
Sure.
Yeah. Anyhow, people say, "Oh, it's nice to build bodies." So yeah, you can build that nice, beautiful fender. Now, duplicate it on the other side. That's when your talent comes in.
That's the trick.
And you can only stretch aluminum 90 degrees. You can't reshape. So a fender that goes like that will have a section here and a section there, and they all have to be welded together.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked Bob one time, what's the procedure there? He says, well, you build the one panel, and with clecos you hold it, and you build another panel, and eventually they all have to meet. And he says most guys will overlap them and try to weld the same, but then he says, no, I would always cut them, butt weld them by hand, gas weld.
Right.
No TIGs, no MIGs, no all the fancy welding. It was gas welded. Yeah. And says, I'm doing a mail order. Guy from somewhere was asking me all these instructions. And at that point of construction, Bob said, the guy's asking me, how do you get it all going? And I told him, well, you get a couple holders and you hold it all together and start your tack welds. The tack weld, don't run a bead. And he calls me back, says, where do I get these holders? He says, your friends. Get a guy that'll hold one panel against the other. He was a very simple, straightforward guy and did a beautiful job on building that body.
Yeah.
It was built out of 40 thousandths thick, 1100 series aluminum. Mm-hmm. And when you're working aluminum, it work hardens. Mm-hmm. And he'd get to a point where he could see it's not stretching or shrinking enough. And he'd take the propane torch and give it a coat of black oxide from just running the acetylene, and then get the blowtorch and just heat it enough to get rid of the black. He said that now has annealed the aluminum, and he'd continue on his merry way to make all those panels.
Wow. Wow. And there were a
beautiful time.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, lost art too. There were the other car that pops into my head with Penske and your time there was the Corvette, the Grand Sport. Tell us a little bit about that when it came in. A little bit of history
The
on it.
Grand Sport, uh, he had moved his garage to Newtown Square. Um, I'm not sure how he got technically involved with getting the two of them under his control, probably through the Sunoco sponsorship, I think,
Mm-hmm.
back in those days. Uh, and I got involved in going to Nassau with them twice. Once with the Corvette and once with a Cooper. Uh, it was funny when he and Jim Hall were running the two cars at Nassau, and just to get the feel for them and which car they're going to use each, they were on a back section runway doing drag race type starts and trying to do a U-turn at the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
And switching back and forth, Roger and Jim in the two cars. And I was sitting in one as a passenger. So I had a little bit of excitement in my early days with those two drivers.
Wow, wow. Um, so after your time with Roger, you got more into the Can-Am series, correct? Or so after your time with Roger, working with Roger, you started to get into the Can-Am. Is that correct?
Well, Roger, being who he was, or is, he was trying to get into dealerships and expand into businesses. And he was offered at the same time period, Bob Holbert was driving Porsches, and Holbert was offering him an opportunity to get a Volkswagen dealership at a good deal in South Philly.
Mm-hmm.
And that didn't seem to favor Roger.
We're
And
getting a little
he
ahead.
was looking around. He was at a country club in the Bellwood Kenwood area of Philadelphia. And he says, one of the guys down there is a Chevy dealership that I'm talking to, and we're going to get together. And it ended up being a 4-year package of McKean Chevrolet and Penske. It was called McKean Penske for 2 years, and then Penske McKean for 2 years. And the end of 2 years, Roger was going to be an envelope package of buying the whole business. So that was basically the start of his Chevy dealerships.
Wow.
All over the country.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, he was never satisfied in status quo. He was always looking ahead to do something bigger.
Mm-hmm.
And using his talents. It got to a point where I think he could have gone to any bank and they'd give him anything he wants,
Mm-hmm.
money-wise, for a loan to do his advancing, because he had a great, great reputation for delivering. There was no problem. His credit line was beyond question.
Wow.
And to me, that's how he built his enterprises.
Well, it kind of brings me to my next question.
You make a promise, you got to deliver it, and he would deliver.
Yeah, and he was always a very smart businessman, always very smart. So, what kind of a guy was Roger to work with? What kind of a guy was he?
Well, back in those days, he was a constant pusher, 910% business in his mind. Um, he got had not a bad, but unusual reputation at that time of, you know, demanding everything from everyone and pursuing everything. Uh, the one cartoon I remember seeing was a four segment cartoon, and it was Roger and coming home from work one day, and he's very tired. And he says, "Oh God, I'm so tired." And he says, "You may call me Roger."
Wow.
Yeah, he was condemned by many people as being too dominant. In a good example there in my memory was when Walt Hanskin got killed at Le Mans. Walt was the Goodyear tire distributor, racing tire distributor, for a big area. And Roger at that point in time was looking into racing tires and wanted to get Goodyear, but Hanskin had it. But when Hanskin got killed that very morning, Roger was on the phone with Goodyear. And people said, "Boy, that seemed kind of cold." I said, "No, that's the business of life."
Mm.
So that's how he became, basically, in my eyes and memory, the Goodyear tire distributor.
Right. Yep. Yeah. So from what year, like what years did you work with Roger?
When he had to get out of racing behind the steering wheel to get the loan for the McKean Chevrolet affair, part of the deal was you know, race drivers live in a dangerous world, so they had to ask him to get out of the seat for the loan.
Mm-hmm.
So that's when he became a race car owner.
Mm-hmm.
Got involved with Mark Donohue, who was an up and coming driver of the years. That's when he built his garage. Not built, but used a garage in Newtown Square,
Mm-hmm.
which was about 20 miles south of Norristown, where I lived. And coincidentally, Newtown Square is where my aunt Peggy lived with Uncle Ed, and she ended up being the babysitter for Mark Donohue.
Yes.
So all along the line, we had a little help that way. And getting into Can-Am, um, Oscar had a good friend named Timmy Mayer. They both lived in Dalton, Pennsylvania. And Teddy Mayer was the money funding behind Bruce McLaren. So we immediately, through that connection, had a connection with McLaren.
As a little side note, how did you meet Oscar Kovaleski?
Through the hill climb circuit, being involved here in northeast Pennsylvania with the hill climbs, we would go there quite often at Wilkes-Barre's Giants Despair. It's the oldest hill climb in the country. Back in the 20s, the Chevrolet boys and everybody imaginable with four wheels would come to the Giants Despair as their test and proof of car ability and driver ability. And in that time period of Penske racing, SCCA events, I got involved with Oscar Kovaleski, who lived up here in Dalton. And he was always running in the same class of the upper class of modified racing. And he had a Ferrari. I forget the model number.
Testarossa?
Testarossa Ferrari of some sort. And he bought that, less engine and driveline. And he bought it out of a guy by the name of Jim Hall in Texas, but it wasn't that Jim Hall. It was another one. And the car was laying in a garage down there, all covered with boxes and shipping. So when I got the car, it had dented fenders and no engine, no transmission. It was set up with a De Dion rear suspension. And I ended up with a Corvette motor in it and a 4-speed. And that was pre the days of a Corvette Stingray. So there was no good differential center section that would take that kind of power for independent rear suspension that the De Dion required. So I do remember taking a standard 12-volt Chevy rear and cutting the hell out of the sides and squeezed it in as far as I could to make a center section out of it with wheel bearings and all, and had to adapt the standard hook U-joint affair out to the Ferrari's wheels. And we ran that car for quite a bit in the hill climbs. And of course, in that time period again, Ferrari didn't have big bad motors.
Mm-hmm.
And we were constantly beating the old Ferraris of the day that would run SCCA. Luigi Cinetti called up Oscar one day and said, "Hey, I want to buy that car." And he says, "What are you going to do with it?" So "I'm going to burn it." He says, "We got to get that out of our life."
Yeah.
So that's how I got involved with Can-Am, because when Bruce got killed and Oscar's Ferrari was getting outdated, he bought a brand new Mark VI McLaren off the British race car show floor, and that he had less engine. He bought it that way. We had a Traco motor put in it, and he went racing with the Mark VI. And then later on, when Bruce got killed, the two factory cars, Bruce and Denny Holm, were up for sale. Mochenbacher was going to buy them both, and he had a sponsorship from 7-Up. And everything went fine with the sponsorship agreements until 7-Up told him that he had to paint the cars green. And Lothar says, I don't drive green race cars. I drive red ones. So he blew the whole sponsorship away because he wouldn't paint his cars green. And the cars again became available. And who bought the other one? Anyhow, Oscar, because of the connection with McLaren and the boys, we ended up with the high wing Bruce McLaren Mark 8B.
Mm-hmm.
And the following year in Can-Am is when they banned the high wing because of its dominance. And everybody had to run the same wing, but it couldn't be any higher than 43 inches off the ground. And it had to be mounted to the chassis. When Bruce ran it, they had their long struts coming down and bolting directly to the wheel uprights. So obviously you get a lot of shock loads going over bumps and all with your wheels. Mm-hmm. And his mounts had nice big rubber bushings in them. And the copycats of racers were building their own wings and not mounting them solid. And they've had instances of the wings falling off during a race. Mm-hmm. So that's when they banned the high wing, and it had to be chassis mounted.
Right. So, as a little side note, and we've talked about this a lot, but you've told me several times, why do you feel that Can-Am was probably one of the greatest racing series?
Well, here in 2020, looking back and back and back and back, as far as you can look for the time period that I've been through racing back into the late 50s, I could see it developing that little by little technology caught up to racing and passed us. Back in the early Can-Am days, cars and the Cooper days of that time period, they were using standard brakes that you'd get off a Triumph or whatever. The technology just wasn't there. What goalpost are we going after right now as to what he did on the my story about Can-Am racing. Why the racing? The series was developed basically after the Formula One series of Europe shut down. So there are all these big highfalutin racers. What are we going to do? And they heard Oscar and was deeply involved with SCCA governorships and all that. And he was involved in setting up this new racing program later in the season for $1 million benefit for these Can-Am cars. So that attracted a lot of the Can-Am people, or European people, to come over and run Can-Am. So they had a great experience with all the cars. The deal of the Can-Am was the race would be a 200-mile race based on the length of any track you're on, whatever the lap distance was. When that track would give you 200 miles, the checker flag would come out. It was green flag to checker. They didn't specify anything more than driver safety. Mm-hmm. There's no ruling on how much gas you could apply. So through the years of Can-Am development, that's when the turbo Porsche monsters had as much as 90 or 100 gallons of gas on board.
Yeah, because there were no pit stops,
If
no
you had to
pits.
pull in
No,
for a pit stop to refuel, you had no way would you gather the front end again
right.
without the pit stops being in a rule.
Hmm.
It was green flag to checker. So you had to build a car that would go that distance without a pit stop. You had to have tires that, in by today's standards, were like driving on hard rock tires, and you're driving on a track that gets continually dirtier lap after lap. God knows who blew a motor in front of you, if it's oily or whatever. And there was no radio communications back to tell the driver, look out for turn 8. And driving that Porsche monster, they would pull almost 1,100 horsepower on 20-inch slicks. And if the motor is still running strong, they've lost 400 pounds of body weight. They had to be bears to drive. And the bears to drive attitude came in the following years at a reunion of Can-Am people at Elkhart, where Denny Holm was there, and we knew Denny, and we were very good friends. And he was driving one of the cars, one of the older cars, and a group from, I won't mention names, but a group from Detroit
Hmm.
that did excellent jobs on restoring these cars, and they were in beautiful condition and excellent preparation. And they won the 8-lap race at Elkhart.
Hmm.
And he came over. Just Danny and my wife Terry were sitting under the tent, and he says, "Hey, what's this I hear about these Can-Am cars being such bears to drive? That was no problem. I won that race easy." And Denny looked up at him, and he says, "Got a mirror? Look at yourself. You're all sweated up. Your face is all flustered." He says, "Fill that gas tank up. Run it until you empty a tank out for 2 hours, and then come in and tell me they aren't bear to drive."
Now the oil cooler was directly in front of you. Is that correct?
Well, any of the rear engine cars have the radiator out in front.
So it was blowing hot air up
So
into
you're
your
blowing
face.
hot air out the exit of radiator
Right.
air.
Right.
Uh, Oster's feet would get hot
Hmm.
down below.
Now there was an Asian driver that came over, and tell us a little bit about that. What happened just from the
he,
fatigue of driving a car
he
like
was
that?
driving a Lola. I think it was at Mid Ohio. Very, very hot day. And halfway through the race, due to heat exhaustion alone, he pulled into the pits, stepped out of the car, and collapsed. And his Japanese crew, in the Japanese cultures of life, he lost face.
Mhm.
They would not allow the medics or anybody to touch him laying there as they packed up their pit area and left
Wow.
before the medics could get to him.
Hmm.
He lost face. They had no respect for him.
Amazing. Incredible. Well,
But that was Can-Am racing,
yeah.
0 to green, and to me, that doesn't happen anymore. I've been promoting lately, and I was talking with Kemper Miller recently about it, and he thinks it's a great idea. And everybody I comment says I think it's a great idea. His brother Paul was running Lamborghinis,
Paul Miller.
Paul Miller,
Yes.
and the Lamborghinis of IMSA ruling with all the restrictions they're all running under. The racing Lamborghini has 200 horsepower less than the street version.
Wow.
So, now, is this racing?
Yeah.
So he got involved with BMW this year, and he's got I don't know what model, Z4s are they?
Yeah.
They
They're.
call them the
Yeah.
Z4. So they were out at Long Beach 3 weeks ago, and Paul won their pre-race
Hmm.
with the new BMW. And I said to Kemper, wow, he did really well. He says, well, IMSA gave him the race basically because the two factory M4 or Z4s, Bill Oberlin and the Turner boys, they were both disqualified in qualifying because they were over revving their engine in one of the turns. There's that kind of checking of all that's going on.
Amazing.
They had the wrong gear ratio for that little straightaway before whatever turn they were going into, and they weren't downshifting or upshifting for the brief time. They just left it in gear, and they over revved a couple times, and that disqualified them in qualifying.
Well,
Now, that's not, to me, that's not racing.
no.
So what we're suggesting is at the end of these seasons now, take these production cars that were restricted like crazy and have another brief race, not requiring pit stop in length. Do whatever you have a month to get prepped. Do whatever you want to that car, getting rid of all the restrictions you have been throwing at you. How fast will they really go?
Right. Yeah.
And everybody I talk to nowadays say that would be a great race because we're so tired of hearing restrictions.
Right. Which Can-Am really didn't have.
Can-Am had no restrictions.
But it was a very different time in racing history, and the camaraderie was very different. Tell me a little bit about the camaraderie of the drivers and also the team owners, all that.
One step backwards on your comments, they were built around with safety factors only for the driver. Anything goes. I never saw the car, but I did hear somebody actually showed up one time with a motor driving each wheel, a four-wheel drive car with motors. But back in those days of no computer control, the guy said it would go like hell in a straight line for like drag racing. But getting into the corners, because he couldn't modulate the RPM differences of each wheel to keep the car going controllably around a corner.
Wow.
So stepping back into your question of the cars themselves, anything would go, and the cars got light, the cars got heavier in power, and that's how they ended up carrying all the gas they had to carry. It was the last real racing.
Yeah. And how were the drivers back then? How did the drivers treat one another? It's very different today.
Oh, drivers and camaraderie.
Yeah.
I think between guys like Oscar, who was a great promoter, and others in the racing game, they know that racing is a spectator sport. TV coverage wasn't great back then, so a promoter had to know that he would have a grid of 20 cars minimum to be able to promote the money required to promote and build a track and pave it, make it smooth, get rid of the potholes and stuff like that. So there was this camaraderie that would build. I often look at it as the phrase we often hear, the bullshit stops when the green flag drops.
Right.
We were all close friends, and it was quite often a guy on a Sunday morning warm-up would have a problem with getting his engine blown or whatever, and there'd be 2, 3, 4 teams getting together. Here's a motor. Get him out on the track. Today's racing, they all cheer. Yay, that's one less to worry about. That camaraderie is greatly missing in racing nowadays.
Agreed.
If you look at a Formula One race, at the end of that race, there are hundreds and hundreds of people going to see the drivers, talk to them, hear the race. You go to the Daytona 500 and they stick a microphone. It was a good race. Yeah, it was a good race. There's no interest in camaraderie, and everybody's too serious about it.
Well, the drivers were more. They had more personality back then. Tell us a
Well,
little bit about
they would
some of the personalities back
the
then.
personality of them all. Uh, Racing is highly intense, and you do a lot of mind thinking and concentration and all that. So after the checkered flag drops, there's a great relaxation in your atmosphere and your feeling, whether you won or not. Uh, People say winning is everything and second place is no. Second place is you're the best of the rest.
Right.
So they were always friendly people in the game. At Riverside, at the end of one of the series, years, I don't recall the scheduling, but there was a big banquet, and up on stage was the column of drivers, Denny Holm, Brian Redmond, Jackie Oliver, that whole group of drivers, David Hobbs. As they went on and on with the questions and answers from the audience was in stitches with all the laughing they were doing, because these guys would relax and tell all the crazy stories about their lives of history. And sitting near us in the audience, they must have been some people from Hollywood. And I heard the one guy said to the other, says, we've been looking in the wrong area for comedians. So these guys are fantastic.
Yeah,
They're so natural at it.
yeah. And they were actually, more friendly with one another. I mean,
Yes,
they certainly did have their,
yes,
the
that was the
competition. And
camaraderie of
yeah,
racing,
right, right.
no doubt.
Is there any story that sticks out in your head with any of the drivers? Sterling Moss, for instance. There was a story about Sterling Moss and Johnson's car wax.
Oscar being the promoter that he is, J-Wax was the sponsor. Johnson J-Wax was the sponsor for Can-Am, and their spokesperson at the time was Sterling Moss. And my wife was very high with production and promotion, all with Oscar, and they were always moving around. They knew everybody. And in our promotion game, we noticed that the J wax in the cup looked just like butterscotch pudding. So we cleaned out a couple of the cans, put butterscotch pudding in them,
Mm-hmm.
and my wife and Oscar's wife were making believe they were waxing the car as the Johnson Wax entourage of employees and enduros were walking down through the paddock
Wow.
area. So when Jim Johnson saw what they were doing, he comes running over. What are you doing? You can't eat wax. So Terry told him what it was. And, he says, so I'll tell you what, Sterling Moss is on a severe diet. He watches everything he puts in his mouth. See if you can convince him into eating wax. And I have photos of Terry talking to Sterling with this little can of wax in her hand, and she talked him into dipping his finger in and
Tasting it.
tasting. And as soon as he recognized it was butterscotch pudding, he said, "Oh, you've blown my diet."
Sir
But
Sterling
things
Moss.
like that would happen in Can-Am that you
Yeah,
just don't see nowadays.
yeah,
Great
yeah.
people.
And regular people, regular
Regular?
guys.
Yep.
Yeah, very approachable, regular
Right.
guys. Yeah. Um, so in today's world of you know big everything, trailers, pit carts, all these things in racing
Yeah,
now,
we used to
many
call it an open
cars.
trailer. The
Right,
McLaren team
right.
actually had 3 open trailers, one for each car and a third trailer for parts and pieces. Their sponsorship with Goodyear was a matter of they would take the wheels, they would take them back to Akron, put the new rubber on, have them Zyglode cleaned up. That was their sponsorship. But the rest of us, would come with our little open trailer. I had a 22-foot closed trailer.
Mm-hmm.
Nowadays, they come in with 6 or 7 tractor trailer loads of
Mm-hmm.
stuff they're selling off,
Right.
all the camaraderie. They don't have the camaraderie of the drivers. They have the camaraderie of the spectators.
Right.
That's where the money is.
Right. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about, um, as far as your program. It didn't. It was very simple back then. Tell us a little bit about your pit cart.
The pit cart you would need for a Transit or a Can-Am race
Yes, correct.
was my little red Flyer wagon,
Mm-hmm.
because the Can-Ams, they usually ran the little aircraft batteries, and the battery power would go down, and your starter would always have a dead battery,
Mm-hmm.
or the car would always have a dead battery for starting. But that's about the only thing we'd have in our pit game. A roll of duct tape in case he bumped the fender at all, because uh, our game plan was to finish. Winning we all dreamed that would be a winner, but we never had the test programs, never had the engine build-up programs. We would just go from one race to another, no
Mm-hmm.
test periods, no
Right.
testing of this and that.
Mm-hmm.
The following year, when Tony Adamowicz got involved, he was a great driver.
Mm-hmm.
Oscar got out of the seat because he realized that he wasn't doing a good job for the car. The first year we ran it at Mid Ohio, he was complaining about uh, these guys out in front of me are going 3-4 seconds faster. So I can't be that far off. Something must be wrong with the car or me. The car felt to him like it's running good and all. So he called Bob Bondurant over and he says, Bob, take the car out in the next practice session and see what you can feel. Well, in about 3 laps, Bondurant was going 4 seconds faster.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which proved to Oscar that the speed is in the car.
Right.
And they sat for the longest time looking at a map. What are you doing here? What are you doing there? And by the end of the practice and qualifying sessions and race, Oscar had picked up those 4 seconds and commented he never knew he had such bad habits. And I've bumped into that so often in amateur racing that the drivers think the, the guy, that winner, must be cheating because I'm cheating like hell and I still can't beat him. It's the driver, not the car. They'll never accept that.
And you've told me this before, but you said that it's very important to make the driver comfortable.
Oh, he
During
has to be comfortable.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about that whole, you know, um, how he feels in the car. The seat, the most important thing in the car is the seat, as Oscar told me at one time. um, but
Yeah, you had to be comfortable in your driver lens, foot pedal pressure, back pressure. All that is very important, especially on these cars that are so rock hard in suspension. You're constantly getting bouncing, uh, which is interesting because in today's Formula One racing, they changed all the aerodynamics,
yeah,
and you can see the drivers' heads bouncing now.
right,
The
right,
cars are porpoising
right.
at the end of the straights with their aerodynamics, but the ability to stay tight in the car and be relaxed to the point where you're not hanging on to it, shoulder bracing, knee bracing, all has to be comfortable.
Well, it takes me into the next question, and the next thing that you've told me about several times is accessibility on a car. What's your philosophy on building a race car and
Uh, Moving up to the GTP series, we were involved in going over to March for a GTP car, and over there talking with Herd.
yeah,
Um, he commented, says, "We're now building these endurance cars, And everybody's telling us, oh, that's a different car now, a different race car than what you've been building. He says, we've been building these formula cars for BMW and other people. So a race car is a race car. And he said, well, with endurance cars, you got to understand that we're out to finish a long race. And there will be incidents in the pits for something wrong with the car or whatever. And in endurance racing, you're only allowed two people working on the car in the pit lane, and you've got to do it by yourself, just these two people. So accessibility to every part on that car is important. I say you got to design the cars to change anything in 10 seconds. And of course, he said, oh, well, that's impossible. So I know the 10-second phrase is, but as fast as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Accessibility to me is very important on working on the cars. When that 82 March arrived they finished it in time. They got it together. It arrived at Miami. I picked it up. We ran the brief laps. I think it only went around, I'd be looking at the records again, but it didn't finish the 24-hour. But when we got the car home, it took Al and I 4 hours to get the body off.
Wow.
Because everything had a nut and bolt rather than a captive nut,
right,
rather than Zeus buttons.
Mm-hmm.
And I bitched at them. I says, two guys could take the entire Can-Am bodies off in a matter of 10, 15 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
Accessibility is very important on a race car. And the car I built for you had that in mind. But of course, you're not going racing, thank God. That piece of jewelry that you built is beautiful. You do an excellent job on keeping it clean.
We try.
You're doing a good job. Yeah, but accessibility is very, very important. Even with the Trans Am car that we ran for Paul and Kemper Miller, it was a 1970 Trans Am car, 305 motor, and they bought it used, less motor, because we're going to run IMSA. And I looked at the IMSA rule book, and yeah, you can do this, you can do that. So I went ahead and bolted all the front end pieces together, cut the radiator brace across the front. Wherever your suspension springs attach to the chassis, from there on, the external parts beyond that are there for cosmetic reasons and carrying other items. They're not there for chassis strength. And in IMSA, you're allowed to build a roll cage to those points in the vehicle. So you end up having a full tubular chassis. So with that Camaro, we ended up being able to take the two bolts by the windshield off the fender, take two bolts by the door jambs off the fender, that's 4 bolts, reach up front, pull a couple electric wire plugs, take the 2 bolts behind on each side of the radiator onto the frame, and with 6 bolts, take the whole nose off the car.
Now, you also did this with another car.
And we did that.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Attitude. Again, we'll back up one car before that.
Okay.
When Kemper bought the CSL from Peter Gregg.
Yep, that was it.
Peter Gregg, it was an ex-factory car of 75. Gregg ran it in 76. And of course, it was built under FIA rules.
Mm-hmm.
And the 75 was FIA, and 76 it was still FIA with Peter. And FIA rules say that roll cages or roll bars are there for driver safety only. They are not to contribute chassis strength. They tell the manufacturers, if you want a strong chassis, build it. Don't expect that. So we ran the car a couple races when Kemper first bought it in 77. And over the winter, I looked at it, and under the IMSA rules and attaching strength to the chassis, I just looked through everything, and everywhere I found cracks in the tub frames or whatever, I would kind of analyze them. Why is it cracking here? What's causing the flexure of metal and all that? So yes, I added weight by adding bars, and to most people, weight is such a terrible thing. But I added the weight. We built the roll cage to add strength to the pickup points in the towers and all, and a few other minor changes in the suspension and aerodynamics. And the following 24-hour affair at Daytona, when we took it down and Kemper took it out for the first practice session, he ran about 15 minutes and came in. I says, "Everything okay?" He says, "Jack, this is an entirely different car. I can feel it now working, and it's working just fine." And if you look at our records under IMSA rules of the following years, he was constantly fastest lap a day, pole positions. So we feel we basically making uh, touring cars transported into race cars. Today's philosophy of manufacturers are the opposite. They build Corvettes and everything else to be race cars, and they detune to be a street car. Kemper Miller's brothers Paul, ran Lamborghinis, and that was his biggest complaint. He says, with all the restrictions, we're running 200 horsepower less than a street car has.
Now going back to,
And
oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
go ahead.
Go ahead. Finish your thought. I'm sorry.
Our train of thought got derailed. Where
It's
were
okay.
we?
Yeah, like I said, this is interviews filled with mistakes. If and we stop and we go, and it's totally fine.
Enter your lines to reality. It's purely coincidental.
Why don't you take it back up from finish your thought?
Yeah, finish your thought. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
What were we doing?
You were talking about Paul Miller and the Lamborghinis being the street cars being more powerful
Yes.
than
yes.
the street cars being more powerful than the race cars.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's when we thought that race series would be great afterward.
Mm-hmm.
In today's standard of racing, the tires, they could run the soft tires, they could run whatever you want. Make it a short race so you don't have to worry about fuel economy and worrying about taking it easy to save another 2 laps or whatever. I think it would be a rather interesting race because you got to keep the spectators happy in this world.
Oh yeah.
We were even talking about that at football a couple years ago about all the bowl games after the series is over. And in any series, there are winners and there are losers. And the losers have spectators, the losers have fans. And I've always thought, up in Wisconsin, there's so many builders of home equipment in the plumbing world.
Very true.
So how about a game up there for the two last place football teams, and we'll call it
Yeah.
the bowl. I'll bet the stands would be full.
Oh yeah.
And I'll bet our race series race would be full.
Yeah. Well,
Got to keep interested in racing because we're not going to go electric car racing. That doesn't make sense to me.
no, not really. No, it's I yeah, it failed. I don't think it did very well. The E series, but
It's exciting. Any racing nowadays is highly intense racing to the drivers
yeah,
and the pit crews because of the time frames involved. But spectator wise, any racetrack out there, any racetrack has a fast groove. The fast lane is only one lane wide. No matter how wide the tracks are or how big the turns are paved for going out wide, if you're running up front, you don't want to go out there where all the marbles and the dirt and all that is. You're going to try to stay in that single lane of traffic. And that's what makes racing boring nowadays, because IMSA tried it, India's tried it with push to pass and wings that flop in Formula One to try to give the guy in second place a chance to pass. Because the cars are all beautifully prepared. The money is no object in that upper level of racing. Do whatever's necessary to win. And the more the racing gets highly intense. You don't have to have lap times at 240 miles an hour to have an exciting race.
Right.
It's passing what makes racing nice. So I don't know how they're going to do it because we've often felt that to the average race car guy, owner, and driver, you're looking at the track as being your enemy, not the other drivers that you're trying to beat. They're just in the way of you trying to win and get the fastest lap on that track. So I don't know, maybe the tracks are obsolete.
It's what you
A
said.
tight, twisty
Yes.
course like Monaco, um, there's no room to pass again because all the cars are equal and
Right.
they're going slower than they can go on other tracks. So how do you even think of getting out of line to pass somebody? How do anybody have any suggestions on how to get racing more exciting?
Well, it's what you had said too. Is technology? You feel
Technology has caught up
with
to
racing.
racing. Um, you could say, well, at the 10 minutes before the start of the green flag, the starter is going to flip a coin, heads and tails. Well, tails, we're going to run this direction this time instead of that direction.
Well, that's part of
Make the cars all neutral that way.
right. Or
No
the
factory tuning for that one track.
right. Yeah, that was what made the Le Mans start so exciting. Drivers running to the car, hopping in the car, and doing the Le Mans start. Yeah. So I just wanted to kind of go back just a little bit to we were talking about Kemper's CSL. Now, for our viewers,
Oh, the M1
no
accessibility.
the CSL. So there was one thing that you so this was the car that won the 1976 24-hour Daytona.
We
The
bite it down.
Well, this you had made a modification to remove the engine and transmission by sectioning the header. But tell us a little bit about that.
Again, the radiator support on the CSL is a 360-degree stamping of sheet metal that supports the front of the fenders and the headlights and all that. Everything beyond the pickup point of the suspension. And in building up the tubular framework that I added and the accessibility concept, pulling a motor and transmission out of a CSL is very awkward. You've got to generally take the headers off. You've got to generally loosen the transmission and be able to get the engine to stand up hanging on a rope. Or you can take the bell housing or the transmission mounts out, and if you're lucky, you can get enough clearance under the car as you're pulling the engine up and getting it out of that hole.
Mm-hmm.
So I went and chopped that top brace off, put flanges on it so you can bolt it back on. And again, with the front end suspension or body work and all, we could take that cross member out and get the engine out a lot easier, or now take the whole nose off and put it back on. Mm-hmm. After one of the crashes where we had to replace the whole nose, got the piece out of the dealership for a normal CS nose affair. And it has two seams running down from the hood opening to the headlight area where you would put it onto your fenders and weld them in and bond over and all that. And that's when I looked at it and says, we're not going to weld it there. We're just going to leave that way. So now I could take the cross brace across, a couple little more nuts and bolts down at the bottom too, and take the whole nose off of the CSL And the engine transmission with headers comes right out,
In one
no
lump.
problem.
Right.
We could change an engine and transmission. And we did that in the M1. Speaking, was it the M1? Yeah. Speaking of longevity, that's another question. Longevity.
Well, we're good. You know,
Well, yeah, I'm good. I
okay.
jumped ahead in my train.
Well,
Get back out of the caboose. Go
so
forward.
what we're you know so um, we could go on. I mean, we could actually make an entire interview just about the accessibility, which we'll get into. But I want to kind of go back to the to that Can-Am time period. So, what time period were you involved? You and Oscar involved with the Can-Am series? From what year to what year?
After selling the Ferrari and getting into an ex-Penske Cooper, in that time period, SCCA was looking to get more and more into the Can-Am affair. So we got into the Can-Am at the birth of Can-Am. Prior to that, it was the SSUSRRC or something.
Mm-hmm.
And we stayed in Can-Am until Oscar had some problems and with the car and not going well. Boy, you got me thinking how to put it into words. Tony Adamowicz taking over. Our highest point in Can-Am with Tony was in fourth points, but we never did a full season.
71.
How did we get out of Can-Am and picking up the Miller boys, I guess?
Well, that's the next chapter. Is
Yeah,
Paul and
we went out of Can-Am into them.
yeah. Um, you want to take a break? You yeah. You want something to drink? Or you?
Is this a pit stop?
We could make a pit stop. Yeah, you want to make a pit stop? We can make a pit stop.